How do you transform an academic book into one that non-academic readers will enjoy? That question is the specialty of Caroline Malloy, PhD, my guest on today's episode. Caroline is a former high school world history teacher who earned her PhD in art history in 2013. After serving as an adjunct professor for a few years, Caroline learned of an opportunity to work as the resident historian on Viking Ocean cruises. She jumped at the chance to travel and try something new. In a serendipitous turn, Caroline began taking on developmental editing and book coaching projects, and the rest, here's a bad pun, is history. In this episode, we discuss the differences between academic and nonfiction texts written for a wider audience, how editors can find joy in this business no matter what their preferred niche is, the importance of centering the reader when writing a book, and marketing tips to help editors attract more clients. Don't miss Caroline's helpful advice for academics who are considering becoming editors, especially her second point, which hits hard and I'm sure will hold a lot of meaning for many of you. If you're an editor who wants to supercharge your business and make 2025 your best year yet, check out my membership, Digital Marketing for Academic Editors. Go to acadiaediting.com/marketing. And if you're just dipping your toes in the water of an all-tac life as an editor or coach, discover how you can make this dream a reality by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Now, here's my interview with Caroline. Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor, the podcast. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. In 2019, I was a political science professor who was fed up with the stress and hostility of academia, not to mention the low pay. I left my tenure-track job and went from barely surviving to thriving as a freelance academic editor. Today, I own Acadia Editing Services, an editing and coaching business that brings in 6 figures a year. In this podcast, I'll discuss the challenges of academia, what academic editing involves, and what life as a freelancer looks like. If you're willing to jump outside your comfort zone, it is possible to find joy, true flexibility, and a profitable and rewarding career as an academic editor. Thanks for listening. I'm talking today with Caroline Malloy, and Caroline is a developmental editor and book coach, and she is going to share with us her journey out of academia. Welcome to the podcast, Caroline.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me. I'm glad to be here.
So let's start off, as we always do. Tell us what you did as an academic and how you left and how you discovered editing as a career.
So it is a circuitous story. I have a PhD in art history from UW-Madison that I earned longer and longer and longer ago, right? Like that gap gets bigger. And so I had, like many of us, a traditional academic path in mind. I never considered anything else. I was actually a high school teacher, decided I wanted to go get my PhD so that I could do more. Not that there's anything wrong with being a high school teacher, just I was a Latin teacher, so I wanted to stop teaching Latin. I actually wanted to talk about more than that. So I was in 100% for teaching. And like many of us, did not have the smoothest path through, did not have the smoothest path out. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that my choices in life were adjuncting or not adjuncting. And as we all know, there's only so long you can do that sustainably. Well, no, you can't do that sustainably. There's only so long you can do that without starting to make other life choices around it. And for me at that point, because I didn't go straight from undergrad into my PhD, I had a bit of a gap. I felt just very established. I was living in Chicago. I was really liking my life. I didn't want to start hopping around and taking 1-year visiting position, right? Like all the things. And so I decided to take a quote unquote sabbatical, did not sign up for my course load as an adjunct for a semester. And coincidentally, at the time, Viking Cruise Lines was launching their ocean cruise ships. And they had this idea that as many of you will be entertained who are listeners of the Police podcast, they had this idea that somehow tenure track scholars had loads of free time and would want to just sail around the world on their ships while actually working full time as tenured professors. So
Wow.
they were posting basically job offers in professional academic journals in the UK. And since my PhD is actually in British and Irish history, all of my professional affiliations were UK based. So I have this month on my hands or semester on my hands. They're looking for young PhDs. I reached out and they had an opening and needed me on a ship in a matter of weeks, Thanksgiving. And I decided to jump. I had no idea what I was doing. I thought this will at least let me talk history. And it became this really wonderful thing for me. And still, it's 8 years later, I still spend a couple months a year on board a cruise ship as a resident historian. This story connects to the editing because what started happening on board is people were coming up to me with book manuscripts. And like, I would be giving a talk on Augustine Rome, and someone would come up afterwards and be like, so I have this mystery novel I'm working on. I'd love for you to read it and give me your opinion. And the first couple of times I was like, this is great, but like, I'm honored, but. And it happened a bunch of times. And I learned a couple things. One is that septuagenarians have a tendency to travel around with printed book manuscripts on vacation because they were handing me printed manuscripts.
Wow, that's hilarious.
And the other thing is that there was something going on, right? And the pandemic hit, everybody was home, and I got a call out of the blue from a good friend who said, I don't know why, I'm working on a book. I think you're the person I need to talk to about it. And I am not a woo person at all, but it's about as darn close to the universe saying there's something here as there could be. And so I pivoted, as many of us did in the pandemic, and I started looking into what is it I could do, right? What were people asking me for? Why, right? What skills was I offering, presenting? And the only thing I knew I didn't want to do is I never wanted to ever have to edit anyone's bibliography. And so when I first started thinking editing, I was like, oh God, I don't know. Like, I don't want to be an editor. I don't want to do that. And then I discovered there's other kinds of editing, and it was like wonderful. And so I basically pivoted into book coaching. At the time, a woman by the name of Jenny Nash had done a blog post with Professor is in Karen Kelsky's page, which I followed devoutly at the time. She's fantastic. And Jenny Nash had posted about book coaching and said, hey, academics, you could take your skills and you could help people write novels. And I thought, this is great. I don't want to help people write novels, but I can help people write really good, better work than what I was seeing, right? I could help academic writers write better books. And so that's what I did. And it took a couple of years, and I pivoted and I've grown. And whereas like so many of us as editors, we start out saying we can edit everything and do anything, I now work specifically with women who are writing nonfiction. My sweet spot is working with academic writers who want to at least consider publishing their next book in a trade press, not an academic press. So I work with a lot of academic writers on their university press books. I do a lot of disc to book work. Folks working on that 10-year book, helping them figure out, how to make it perfect before they submit it. But I also do a lot of work with academic writers who say, all right, I have tenure. I hear a lot, this is the book I've wanted to write, and sometimes we shop it around and it gets picked up by a trade press. The nice thing about academic writers is almost always they have academic presses to fall back on. So like it's writers who always have a backup plan. And sometimes we wind up publishing with an academic press anyway. And it's great. And everybody lives happily ever after. And so that's where I am. Long story, but that's how I landed here.
No, that's great. I think you're probably the third or fourth person I've had on the podcast who has that story of like the serendipitous, all of a sudden the stars aligned and the heavens opened and it was like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, and it's great. I think it's so cool to hear that. And then also to hear you talk about how you started out kind of wondering, what can I do? What does the market need? What are people asking for? and then found a way to do to make a business out of what you actually enjoy doing, because we're all so different. And I had a member of my community the other day. We were talking, and he said he finds editing references list to be very therapeutic. And and I sort of do too. Like, I definitely go towards the copy editing side of things, And so it's funny how everybody just has this different, they're drawn to different things, which is great because we're not competitive, where I think that's what helps make editors. We're not competitive. We're sharing work, like you do a developmental edit, then I do the copy edit, and, it's more collaborative. So that's so cool.
Yeah, I think to that awakening point, because I think so many of us are so focused, right? Like we only have that one track coming out of the PhD, that it sometimes takes something radical to be like, wait a second, look, there's another option over here that isn't, because you can't imagine other options, I think, sometimes when you get down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and we're told that there aren't other options, right? Like we're constantly, it's repeated to us that this is what you're supposed to do. This is the track you're supposed to follow, and anything else is failure. And then when you're out of it, when you're out of that box, you realize how ridiculous it is and how false it is. But so talk to me about how you started out with doing the developmental editing. How did you build on that to get to this point where you work specifically with authors who are wanting to write more of a nonfiction or mass market type book?
So actually, it kind of went the other direction. I wanted to work with academics, but I assumed early on that would be a harder market to break into, because I worried very much about biases, as we all do, that academics wouldn't want to work with someone like myself who was out of academia, right? And so I kind of had this broad idea of anyone who's really knowledgeable, and started with that big picture. And I started coaching and didn't get into developmental editing until I realized that I was pretty much doing that in some cases, and it was fun and easy and lovely and wonderful. And so I kind of added that into what I was doing. But in terms of niching into the academic writers I work with now, it was, like I said, always the goal. And it really was a case of intentional or not. I think I was talking about and marketing myself in ways that were familiar, right? In ways that were recognizable, even if it's language patterns. It's the network I started with, right? It was always academic. And so instead of letting the fact that I wasn't formally in academia anymore be a hindrance, I actually pivoted there and was able to say, wait a second, I have something that is valuable if you are still in academia. I can help you translate, right? I can be that person who says, hey, your discipline is awesome, but we all learn to write by my favorite, right? Every sentence practically in a good academic manuscript, and the dissertation, of course, has opens with all these subordinate phrases, right? Having done this, about to do whatever, if you look at an academic book, you're like, oh my God, that's all we are taught to do, is we write by hedging our bets and contextualizing every single thought. The first thing I say to academic writers, if you want to think about shifting your book across, is to just go through and clear every single opening prepositional phrase from your book, and it instantly is a different book, because you are not apologizing, you're not hedging your bets. And it's that sort of translational stuff I love doing, to be able to say, hey, you're awesome, you are the best at your field. But people out here are not speaking that way.
And they're not reading with such a critical eye, right? I think academics write with the anticipation of being criticized, that we have to add all these caveats, because if not, then someone will say, oh, but you didn't say this, and the average person is not out. They just want to learn from you, because they take at face value that you're an expert, and
right.
They have so much they can learn from you.
Yeah. And it's fun to unlock that. And then, I don't even mean this as worst case scenario, but worst case scenario, you go through, you clean up a book that you want to publish with a trade press, and it doesn't work, and you pivot back to a university press. It's always a better book, because you actually have cleaned up your language. You've written more confidently, right? You've taken out all of that fear and concern, and your peer reviewers are going to be peer reviewers and a nuisance anyway. But, it doesn't matter how many caveats you have. So it works out well to go through and kind of translate a little bit more generally, I think.
So how did you learn that? Like, how did you learn what makes a good nonfiction book? Did you do any kind of training, or was it just innate from having read a lot of nonfiction books? Or
So in terms of training, I did take Jenny Nash's course program some years ago, which I found really interesting as like a continuing education or lateral move, to basically just think about books differently than I am trained to as a scholar. And that was really helpful. I also think a lot of it comes from my own experience in grad school and my own writing of personally banging against some of the ways that I needed to write. As an academic, writing was my least favorite part of the process, which is kind of weird now that I'm an editor. I hated it. It just didn't feel comfortable. And I spent years with advisors and such kind of banging at the edges and saying, like, why can't we just say this? Or why can't it work this way? And reading like journalistic nonfiction going, geez, this is something somebody wants to read. This is something that like 3 people are being forced to read because their advisor made them. Like, that gap to me was always really big. And so I think that's really where that comes from, of I could see it and it frustrated me when I was in it. And so I've kind of just continued to work on that. And like I said, taking some writing courses that are not academic and getting involved in general coaching and editing circles, and in addition to my academic coaching and editing circles, is really helpful to, again, straddle and like be slightly outside of the disciplinary world that we all get so entrenched in.
so how do you think clients started finding you, like at the beginning and as your business was growing, and then today? Has that shifted, or is it mainly referrals, word of mouth? How do you think people have found you over the years?
It started as referrals. And there was, I think, for me, a noticeable shift last year, maybe a year and a half ago, in terms of how I wanted to market myself. I kind of started out going, how do editors market themselves? And none of it worked because it didn't feel right at all for an academic market. And I shifted last year or so over to LinkedIn, and really leaned into that as a space to talk, and found that to be incredibly valuable for how, like I said, how I'm presenting my business, the kinds of conversations I'm having. And I think I was kind of being able to speak to the right groups of people, and then from there, referrals continue. But I do have a lot of people who come to me and say, I saw a video that you posted on LinkedIn, and I really love the way you were talking about this issue, or, that sort of thing. So,
How often do you post?
when things are clicking. So haven't figured out the whole scheduling social media thing yet for 3 years. It's just not my vibe. Some people are like, I have a scheduler, it's great. And I'm not organized enough for a scheduler. I try to post 3 or 4 times a week. But then sometimes life gets in the way and things slow down. But I find that that's a nice sweet spot for me. So yeah, talking about writing, talking about nonfiction, talking about what I'm reading, what people are reading. A lot of material, as I'm sure with most editors, comes from books that you're working on. Not that I share what my writers are working on, but maybe a conversation I have with a writer where we go down the rabbit hole about such and such a thing, then becomes a couple of LinkedIn posts, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm with you on the life gets in the way or other business gets in the way. It is hard to keep up on social media. And I like LinkedIn because it does feel like that kind of, not really stream of consciousness necessarily, but just kind of like I can get on there and I can say what I've been thinking about, or you can kind of just blat your ideas down on the paper, so to speak, or like you said, I was having a conversation with a client the other day and here's what we were talking about. And it feels very authentic to me. Whereas Instagram, and Facebook feel more curated. Like on Instagram, you're supposed to make these reels and you're supposed to dance around and like you have to have a hook. And like, I'm so tired of trying to think of hooks, and whereas like on LinkedIn, you just kind of put what you're thinking about and people have this authentic, genuine conversation with each other.
And I think the thing on LinkedIn is people are also looking to read it. Right? I mean, your Instagram people are just like scrolling through looking at images. Nobody's really reading. I don't know what the hashtags do, like all of that. But on LinkedIn, the community there is intentionally there to read from other people what they are knowledgeable about, right? Following small business folks or like major thought leaders. And it's a learning community in a lot of ways. Like once you get past it used to be just for resumes, and I'm sure there's a section of LinkedIn that's still just for hiring. But at least I see it, and it sounds like you see the same thing. It really is a space for thoughtful, intellectual people to engage in conversations relative to their discipline or their sphere of the world. And in so doing, you forge really interesting connections, but it allows me as an editor and coach to showcase my expertise in a way that is not pushy. It's authentic. It's like, hey, I'm talking about what I do. If you want to listen, like, come on, I want to hear what you have to say. And it's really a fantastic community that way, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation that how it's changed over the years. I think probably 10 years ago, it was like a virtual job fair or something where you're like, here's my resume. Are you hiring? And now it's very much more it's social media, but at an elevated level, like where we are there to actually have meaningful exchanges as opposed to like, and I think you get that sort of like on Blue Sky or Threads or old Twitter, but it was limited by the character limits. And LinkedIn, you can tell those full stories and have longer conversations, I think. So
yeah.
That's great. So if anybody listening to this who I know I have a lot of people in my community that I've talked with who are like, oh, LinkedIn is weird. I don't want to go, they feel like they're putting on their suit and going to the job fair. And I'm going, no, get on there, connect with people, give it a chance. It's different now. So yeah, so that's great to hear that from you. So what are, thinking about when you're working with these academic clients to help them make their book more readable or more enjoyable to read, what are some of maybe I should step back. First, have you seen an increase in the number of academics who want to shop their book around to commercial presses as opposed to university presses recently? And then what are some of the common challenges that you see, or mistakes that writers are making, things that you see repeating that you give advice on?
Yeah. So to your first question, I don't know if it's a more recently. My writers tend to skew to a certain age bracket or a certain experience level, because if you got to write the tenure track book first, you got to write the tenure track book first. Very rarely is someone in a position to be like, I'm golden for a couple of years. I'm going to work on this over here and not submit it to Oxford or wherever. So it is normally a scholar at a certain position where they are confident enough in themselves within their discipline and are respected enough that they have the luxury, I think, to turn and say, I don't want to, many of them are like, I love my academic publisher, right? My university press has been great to me, but this book, this is the one. Sometimes it's someone, I've worked with writers who are like, this was my dissertation 20 years ago. I've saved it, right? Like I wrote a different book. I got my tenure. This is the one that I've been holding on to for all that time. Or, this is the book I'm secure. This was part of my last book, but I, wanted to do more. A lot of times conversations will be like, I wanted to do more with this person or this part of the book. And my editor said no, right? Like I couldn't go. And so I saved it and it's going to come over here. And now I get to run with it. And there's often that sense with these writers of like, I don't want to say liberation so much as it's like, I'm finally free to fly on this, right? I can do this and make it what I want. And in the end, it doesn't go there. I can still bring it back to my other editor and they're still thrilled with it. So I don't know if it's a more, as much as it is There are some scholars who get to a certain point in their careers and they would like to not write their next book for an academic press. It's that simple. And there's plenty of scholars who are like, I never want to publish with a trade press ever. I love, Princeton, or I love whomever. Like, I love my university press. They're great to me. Why would I ever want to leave? So there's that. In terms of advice, a lot of it is linguistic. A lot of it is recommending that they read books that are not academic books to see what that looks like. There are several, not all, most writers who are academics who are looking to publish for trade are more broadly read in the nonfiction space to begin with. But sometimes it really is a matter of saying, like, have you read a book generally like what you want to write that was not published by a university press? Because if you haven't, you should. And, so we kind of curate a reading list. But it's often a matter of, like you were saying earlier, I feel the reminder I give my writers the most is that this is the book that people will read and people will not judge you for. No one is going to read it to find out what's wrong with you, what you missed, what you omitted, who you didn't cite. This is going to be a book that people will want to read. And so I do a lot of work with writers, academic writers and non-academic writers, on centering the reader. And for academic writers, I think that could be really helpful to think about, what does that reader look like and what do they need? If they are not in your field, if they are really happy that some scholar like you did all the research, so they don't have to, and they can just learn about whatever your topic is and enjoy it, and they'll be happy, right? Like, they're thrilled for you. And I think that's really hard for us as academics to wrap our head around. Like, no, people are just going to be happy to read your book. Just happy about it. And they'll learn and they'll love it. And like, that's possible. And that opens up language, because then it can be conversations about, your reader has no idea what you're talking about here. And they haven't read Foucault, quite simply.
No, that's great. And, as you were describing that about centering the reader, it made me think about marketing, which I think a lot about these days. Because when I started I never imagined I would own a business. I was always sort of anti-business, when I was growing up. And since I started a business, and especially since I started selling my courses and programs, I've realized I need to learn how to market. And I think if there's one thing that I would point out, it is that you have to center your audience in all of your messaging. And I think that's probably a challenge for, at least from what I've seen dealing with academics who are moving into, business ownership, is they always want to lead on their website with their bio. Like, I have 15 years experience in higher ed, and I've published all these articles and blah, 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 blah. And so one of the biggest points that I try to teach is you have to center your potential client and what do they need? What are they looking for? And before we started talking, I was looking at your website, and it's fantastic. I think it's a great example of how to do that, because you really talk about how you can help people solve their problems.
I think kind of like I was saying about, people want to read your book. If you're an academic publishing for a general audience, they're really impressed by a PhD or whatever your credential is at the end of your name. And as far as websites concerned, that was an early lesson for me. It was like, I don't need to talk about how many years I spent teaching and all of these things. I had some early clients who were not academic even, who were like, oh, you're a PhD. I'm going to trust you on this. And I was like, that's not enough, right? You should look further. And then my early academic clients, I didn't need to make the case to them either, because they were like, I just want someone. I've had writers early on, particularly, like, I just want someone who's got a PhD because they know where I'm coming from. Right. So simply the silly letters that I don't think really, like, right. We don't center them in academia the same way, but like outside of academia, that was all that you need. And I think as an academic, we should trust that, like, people are just happy to see it. Like, that's all you need to say about yourself. It speaks volumes, and you can ethically worry about whether or not you should be following it up with more, but for the moment, you don't need it on your website.
Yeah, it's like, I think whether you're talking about the book that the author is writing or the website that we're making, it's like the audience assumes they take you at your word. They assume that you know what you're talking about. And then the question is this the right fit for me? When we're
Right.
picking up a book at Barnes and Noble or wherever, our local bookstore, we're flipping through it. We're not going, does this author really know what they're talking about? We're looking at like, does this sound interesting? Do I want to spend my
Yes.
evenings reading this? And the same thing on a website. Okay, this person has a doctoral degree, whatever. Do they seem like somebody I want to work with? Are our personalities going to click? Are they going to be judgy and overly critical? Or are they going to be supportive and help me accomplish what I want to accomplish?
Are they speaking my language, right?
Yeah.
When they read it, do they feel seen?
Yeah. That's great. This has been such a fun conversation. I think I told you in our emails, I was excited to hear that you do this work of helping people write or turn academic books into trade books, because I have had several scholars ask me about this, and I just don't feel like it's the right fit for me. So I'm really glad to know that this is your jam, because I can send them your way when they ask me that. But so if people want to get in touch with you, what you had some, so you do coaching as well, right?
Yeah.
What are the main offers if people are looking to work with you? What can they look for on your website, like in terms of services and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, particularly for academic writers. So I do a lot of work on proposals. So an academic book proposal is similar to, but very different from a trade book proposal. So I do a lot of proposal coaching where we work together for a bunch of months and build out that proposal. That then, if you do pitch a university press, you can take what we've worked on and pivot it. I had a writer who used it as the foundation for a fellowship application in addition to her book proposal. So there's a lot of things you can do with it. So I do a lot of proposal work. I also do just general monthly coaching, where I'm kind of there as an accountability partner, but normally only with writers that I've worked on something else with. For some writers who are coming to this trade book, I have a kind of 4-week workshop, boot camp. I don't know what you want to call it. I change the name of it all the time on my website, which is bad for my SEO. But basically 4 weeks to kind of figure out foundationally what the book needs to look like, figure out who that reader is, figure out what a table of contents would look like for something that is, right, not your dissertation, not your academic book. So normally the inroads for me with writers are they either come to me, we work for 4 weeks and go from there, kind of build that book out, or we work on a proposal together. I also do developmental editing, but that's a one-off thing, and that's just fun when somebody comes to me and says, I have this great book. Can you read it and give me some feedback? And like, yes, this is awesome. This is why I love my job.
Mm-hmm. So the question I ask everybody is if you could give 1 or 2 pieces of advice to either people who are thinking of going into editing or people who are just starting out as editors, what would it be?
The first thing would be there's a lot of different kinds of editors. Like we were talking about earlier, editing is not monolithic. There are editors who love to do bibliographies. There are editors who love to coach. There are editors who do line editing, right? There's a lot of ways in, so it's not a monolithic thing. So if there's something that you think of that you're like, ooh, that's editing, I don't want to do that. That may be one part of editing that you don't want to do, right? Do not hire me to copy edit anything, ever. So that would be one piece of advice. And it's a much bigger field than I think some of us might realize. The other piece of advice, and this is really personal from my perspective, your colleagues will not judge you for it. I spent a lot of time struggling with that. It is not a step down. And we all, I think many of us who leave academia and, unwillingly struggle with various parts of that. And so it is the next great thing for you if you let it be. And that, thinking backwards is not the way to think about it. Thinking forwards and saying, wow, I do this very cool thing and I get to read books and enjoy everybody else's work and still do whatever it is you want to do. If you want to keep writing your own book, You can do it.
Oh, I love that. That is so powerful because I think so many people struggle with that. Even when they've made the decision that they want to leave and they're going to leave, they worry so much about like the shame of I
Yeah.
failed or I'm doing this other thing. People are going to think I'm weird because I'm owning a business or something. And not like you were saying earlier, the clients don't care, like I've never had a client who's like, why did you leave academia? Like they don't care. They're happy to find somebody with an academic background to work with you. And so and then if the work makes you so unbelievably happy, like it does for me, and I think it does for you, who cares? Like I'm living this life that I never dreamed was possible
Yeah.
and would not be possible if I had stayed in academia. And so, like, if somebody doesn't like that, then, too
I think
bad.
the who cares is hard to get to, though, right? The who cares. I don't know if it was for you, but it wasn't instant for me, right? You got to grow towards that, like, oh, like you got to come out the other side.
Yeah, no, I think I was so pissed off when I left that it was just like,
Okay,
I'm ready to burn it all down. And so,
I do
but
know.
I do have moments where I think about like previous mentors or, if I were to run into my dissertation advisor somewhere, how would I feel telling him that this is what I do now? And I think there is a little seed still of like, not shame, but maybe a little bit embarrassment or something like that. But so I do think it takes a lot of work to get over. But then I live my life where I'm getting ready to go on a cruise tomorrow with my family and I'm not stressed and I'm chilling, having a cup of coffee, packing my luggage.
You're not taking all your papers with you.
Right. I'm not going to do a bit of work while I'm gone. And it's like, yep, I made the right decision. This is right. So great.
Absolutely.
That's so fantastic. So if people want to get in touch with you, they can find you on LinkedIn. Right?
Definitely.
And
I am
where
on LinkedIn
else?
all the time. My website is pretty easy place, therightmalloy.com. And it's WRITE because early business mistake. No one told me you don't use a pun for your business name. I thought it was very clever, but I have to now spell it out for everyone. So most people say, right, this business advice, use your name. I was like, nah, I'm cooler than that. I should have used my name. So therightmalloy.com.
And I will put that in the show notes so everybody can see it there.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for joining me, Caroline.
Thanks for having me, Paulina.
If you're unhappy in academia and you think you might be a good editor or writing coach, check out my course, Becoming an Academic Editor. This digital course is paired with a 12-week group coaching program to support you through your decision to leave academia or not, and to start building a profitable and rewarding academic editing business. Learn more by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.